The first sound was not human. It was the sound of a world cracking open, a deep-throated roar that tore through the pines and rattled the single pane of glass in Alara's cabin window. It was the voice of Claw and Fong, of a power that predated axes and rifles. She froze, her hand deep in a pail of soapy water, the lie stinging a small cut on her knuckle. Then came the other sound. A sharp, defiant yell, cut short. Not a cry of fear, but a fury. Alara straightened slowly, wiping her hands on her coarse wool skirt. She moved to the door, her motions deliberate, wasting nothing. The wind, always a mean gossip on this ridge, carried the sounds of a terrible struggle. The splintering of wood, the violent thrashing in the undergrowth, and that gut-wrenching roar again, this time thick with rage. She took the rifle from its pegs above the door. It was Elias's rifle. Heavy and solid, smelling of oil and old grief. She did not think. Thinking was a luxury for people with neighbors, for towns with a sheriff. On this mountain there was only action and consequence. She stepped out onto the porch, the worn boards groaning a complaint. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth, and now something else. The metallic tang of blood. Her eyes scanned the tree line, 100 yards distant, a dark wall of green and shadow. The sounds were coming from a small clearing just inside the woods where a lightning-struck oak had fallen years ago. She saw movement. A flash of brown fur, immense and rippling with muscle. A grizzly. A monster of a thing, its back a great hump of power. It rose on its hind legs, blotting out the light, its shadow falling long and hungry. And beneath it a man. He was Comanche. She could tell by the buckskins, the single feather tied in his long black hair, now matted with dirt and blood. He was not a raider she recognized, but they were all ghosts on the edge of her world, whispers in the general store miles below, reasons for the extra bar on her door. He had a knife in his hand, its blade a sliver of desperate light. His other arm was bent at an angle that made her stomach clench. The bear swiped, a motion of impossible speed for its size, and the man rolled, but not fast enough. Claws the length of Alara's fingers raked across his shoulder and chest, leaving behind ribbons of red. He made no sound, only a sharp intake of breath, a grunt of pure, animal will. Alara lifted the rifle. The stock settled into the familiar hollow of her shoulder. She had killed deer with this rifle. A wolf once that had gotten too bold. But this was different. The bear was nature's own judgment. To interfere felt like arguing with a thunderstorm. The man on the ground scrambled backward, his leg dragging. He propped himself against the fallen oak, his face a mask of sweat and blood, his eyes fixed on the beast. He was cornered. He was dying. He held the knife up, a futile gesture of defiance. He was choosing how he would end, not if. And in that moment, in his defiant silence, Alara saw not a Comanche, not a threat, but a reflection. She saw the same stubborn refusal to yield that had kept her on this mountain after Elias was gone. The same hard silence that filled her own empty cabin. It was a language she understood better than words. She lined up the sight. The wind was still. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The bear dropped to all fours, its head low, a growl vibrating in its chest. It was gathering for the final charge. Alara's finger tightened on the trigger. She did not aim for the head, the skull was too thick. She aimed for the heart, the lung, the place where that terrible roar was born. The shot was an explosion that ripped the silence to shreds. The bear flinched, a tremor running through its massive frame. It staggered, turning its head with a look of pure, murderous surprise. It saw her then, a small figure on a distant porch. It let out another roar, this one weaker, laced with pain and confusion. It took a step toward the cabin, then another, before its legs buckled. It fell to the earth with a shuddering thud that seemed to shake the roots of the trees. For a long moment, there was only the echo of the gunshot fading into the vast, indifferent sky. The man by the oak did not move. His head was slumped forward, the knife still clutched in his hand. Alara watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She reloaded the rifle out of pure instinct, the metallic click of the cartridge seeding into the breech a small, solid sound in the sudden, heavy quiet. She waited. Was he dead? Was this all for nothing? Slowly his head lifted. He looked at the dead bear, then his eyes found her. Across the distance she could not read his expression. There was no gratitude, no fear. Only a deep, unnerving stillness. He tried to push himself up and fell back with a groan, his hand going to his mangled leg. Alara lowered the rifle. She had made a choice. Now came the consequence. She went back inside the cabin, her hands trembling slightly. She grabbed a canvas roll of bandages, a jar of pungent salve, and the canteen from the hook by the door. Then, without a backward glance, she walked off the porch and toward the tree line, toward the man and the monster she had slain. The journey to him was a walk through a new world. The grass was flattened where he had fought. The air was thick with the coppery smell of his blood and the rank, musky scent of the bear. He watched her approach, his dark eyes following every step. He was like a cornered wolf, wounded but still dangerous. His knuckles were white around the hilt of his knife. She stopped a few feet away, holding up the canteen. His gaze flickered from her face to the water, then back. A long, silent minute passed. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. Finally, with a motion so slow it seemed to take all his remaining strength, he let the knife fall from his fingers. It landed softly in the pine needles. Alara knelt, unscrewed the cap of the canteen, and held it to his lips. He drank, his throat working convulsively. Water spilled down his chin, tracing a clean path through the blood and grime. When he was done, he slumped back against the log, his eyes closing for a moment. "You hurt bad," she said. Her voice sounded strange, rusty from disuse. He did not answer. He just watched her as she untied the canvas roll. The wounds were worse up close. Deep gouges that wept blood. The skin torn away to reveal the muscle beneath. His leg was twisted, the bone clearly broken. He would have bled to death. He still might. She worked in silence, cleaning the wounds as best she could with water and strips of cloth. He bore it without a sound, his body rigid, his jaw clenched. His stoicism was a fortress. She packed the wounds with the strong-smelling salve, a concoction of yarrow and pine tar that burned but stopped the bleeding. Her hands were gentle but firm, the way one handles a spooked horse. She splinted his leg with 2 straight branches from the fallen oak, binding them tight with strips of her own petticoat. It was a crude fix, but it would hold him for the journey back. The entire time he just watched her. His silence was not empty, it was full of questions she could not answer, thoughts she could not read. Getting him back to the cabin was a slow, agonizing process. He could not walk. She was strong, her body hardened by years of solitary labor. But he was a heavy man. She looped his good arm over her shoulders and half-dragged, half-carried him, his wounded leg scraping uselessly against the ground. He tried to help, pushing with his good leg, but his strength gave out every few feet. They moved through the world in a bubble of shared pain and effort. The only sounds were her grunts of exertion and his sharp, pained breaths. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. The shadows grew long like grasping fingers. By the time they reached the porch, dusk had fallen. The cabin was a dark silhouette against the fading light. She maneuvered him through the door and lowered him onto the rag rug by the hearth, the only soft place on the floor. He collapsed there, his body shuddering with exhaustion and pain. Alara lit a lamp, the flame chasing the shadows into the corners. The small room flickered to life. It was a sparse space containing only what was necessary: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a cold hearth. A life stripped down to its barest bones. She built a fire, her movements efficient. The kindling caught, and soon a small, cheerful blaze was crackling, throwing warmth and dancing light across the man's still form. He had not moved. His eyes were closed, his face pale beneath the dried blood. She left the rifle by the door, within easy reach. She did not know this man. He was the enemy, the subject of fearful stories. Yet his blood was on her floor, and his life was a fragile thing in her hands. She had crossed a line, and she did not know where it would lead. She made a thin broth, boiling water with dried herbs and a little salt. She spooned it into him, lifting his head gently. He swallowed, but his eyes remained closed. His skin was hot to the touch. A fever was setting in. That night, she did not sleep in her bed. She sat in the chair opposite him, the fire between them, the rifle resting across her lap. She watched him, listening to his shallow, fevered breathing. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not empty anymore. It was waiting. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying secrets she did not want to hear. The next days bled into one another, a blur of routine and vigilance. The man, her silent patient, drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness. Alara tended to him with a detached efficiency that was a lie. Each time she changed his dressings, cleaning the angry wounds, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. His life felt as fragile as a bird's egg in her palm. During his lucid moments, he would simply watch her. His gaze was heavy, unnerving. He watched her chop wood, his eyes following the swing of the axe. He watched her knead bread, his focus on the rhythmic push and pull of her hands in the dough. He watched, and he learned the shape of her life, the quiet cadence of her solitude. She never turned her back on him completely. The rifle was always close. But the weight of it in her lap felt different now. Less like a tool of defense and more like a barrier. He did not speak. Not a single word. She did not know his name. He was just the man, a presence. A weight in the small cabin that had reordered her universe. On the third day, the fever broke. She found him awake, his eyes clear for the first time. The heat had gone out of his skin. He had pushed himself up to a sitting position, his back against the stone of the hearth. She ladled deep broth into a bowl and brought it to him. He took it from her, his fingers brushing hers. His touch was rough, calloused, but there was a startling lack of threat in it. He drank the broth himself, slowly, deliberately. When he was finished, he set the bowl down. He looked at his splinted leg, then at the bandages on his chest. His eyes found hers. He lifted a hand and tapped his own chest twice. Covey, he said. The word was low, rough from disuse, but clear. It hung in the air between them. A name. A piece of himself offered up. She hesitated for a beat, then nodded. Ilara. The exchange felt monumental, like signing a treaty. That afternoon, a change occurred. He was still weak, but a current of life was flowing back into him. While she was outside, splitting kindling, she heard a faint scratching sound from the cabin. Her hand went to the small axe at her belt. She moved to the doorway, silent as a shadow, and peered inside. Covey was sitting up. He had found a piece of charcoal from the hearth and was drawing on a loose floorboard. She watched, unseen. He was sketching the bear. Not the monster of the fight, but a powerful, noble creature. He drew it with a strange reverence, his lines sure and economical. He was giving the beast its spirit back. She stepped inside and he stopped, his hand hovering over the drawing. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something other than pain or suspicion in his eyes. It was a quiet question. She walked over and looked down at the charcoal sketch. She pointed to it. You honor him. Covey nodded once, a short, sharp gesture. He then looked at the rifle on its pegs. He looked back at her. The question was clear. Why? Why had she saved him, an enemy, from a creature he seemed to respect? Ilara had no easy answer. She had asked herself the same question in the long, silent hours of the night. She looked around the small, empty cabin. At Elias's chair. At the single cup she used each morning. The silence was too loud, she said, more to herself than to him. He did not seem to understand her words, but he seemed to grasp their meaning. A flicker of something, maybe empathy, crossed his face. He rubbed the charcoal drawing away with the heel of his hand, erasing the bear, leaving the floorboard blank once more. It was a gesture of respect for her space, her home. The unspoken contract shifted. He was no longer just a patient. She was no longer just his keeper. The next morning, Ilara rose before dawn, as was her habit. She moved quietly, stoking the embers of the fire back to life. As the cabin filled with a soft, gray light, she looked over at Covey. He was awake, watching her. She went about her morning chores. When she came back inside with a bucket of fresh, cold water from the well, she saw that he had moved. He had dragged himself over to the small pile of which she had brought in the night before. Using his good hand and his knife, which she had left on the mantelpiece, he was shaving kindling. Small, perfect curls of wood were piling up beside him. It was a small act, but it was a profound one. He was contributing. He was paying his way not with coin or goods, but with effort. He was taking a piece of the burden. She stopped in the middle of the room, the water bucket heavy in her hand. A strange feeling bloomed in her chest, something warm and tight and unfamiliar. It felt dangerously close to hope. She put the bucket down and went to the larder. She took down a slab of salted bacon and a handful of dried apples, things she saved for special occasions. She cooked them in a pan over the fire he had helped prepare. The smell filled the cabin, rich and savory. She served him a plate. He took it, his eyes meeting hers over the rising steam. And then he spoke the second word she would ever hear him say. A word in his own tongue. She did not know its meaning, but the tone was unmistakable. It was thanks. They ate in their usual silence, but it was a different silence now. It was shared. It was comfortable. The space between them was no longer a chasm of suspicion, but a bridge they were building, one small, silent gesture at a time. Later that day, she sat on the porch, mending a tear in one of Elias's old shirts. Covey had managed to pull himself to the doorway. He sat leaning against the frame, watching the sun filter through the leaves. And that is when she saw them. At first, they were just specks on the far ridge, dark shapes against the bright sky. But they were not deer or shadows. They were moving. They were riders. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands stilled on the shirt. There were 5 of them. Then 10. Then more. They flowed over the ridgeline like a dark river, spreading out, forming a silent, watchful crescent that overlooked her small, isolated homestead. Section Comanche. Covey saw them too. He stiffened, his body going rigid. He tried to push himself up, his hand reaching for a weapon that was not there. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The consequence she had been waiting for. They had come for him. Or for her. The riders did not advance. They just sat on their horses, still as statues, their faces unreadable from this distance. They were a silent, terrifying judgment. The entire valley seemed to fall silent, holding its breath. The wind died. The birds stopped singing. Her home, her sanctuary, was surrounded. The world had shrunk to the space of her porch, the cabin at her back, and the silent line of warriors on the ridge. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken threat. Alara felt a primal fear, cold and sharp, slice through her. Her first instinct was to run inside, bar the door, grab the rifle. But she looked at Covey. He had managed to get to his feet, leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face a grim mask of pain and resolve. He was looking at his people, his jaw set. He was weak, wounded, but he was preparing to stand. He was preparing to die for her, the woman who had saved him. Seeing his quiet courage snuffed out her own fear. She had not come this far, had not survived Elias's death and the crushing loneliness that followed, to be undone by fear. This was her land. This was her home. She laid the mending aside, her movements slow and deliberate. She stood up. She did not go for the rifle. That would be a challenge, an act of aggression. Instead, she stood on her porch, her hands empty at her sides, and she waited. She would meet their silence with her own. Covey looked at her, a question in his eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Stay. He hesitated, then understood. He remained in the doorway, a silent guardian at her back. They stood together, a united front of two broken people against a silent, watching army. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the valley. Sweat trickled down Alara's back. Her muscles ached with tension. Still, the riders did not move. They were testing her, watching, waiting for a sign of weakness. Then one rider detached from the line. He moved his horse forward, not at a charge, but at a slow, deliberate walk. He was older than the others, his hair streaked with gray, his face a roadmap of time and hardship. He carried a long, feathered lance, not as a weapon, but as a staff of office. A chief. He rode down into the small meadow in front of her cabin and stopped, a respectful distance away. He did not dismount. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over her, over Covey in the doorway, over the cabin itself. They lingered on the massive bearskin she had scraped and stretched to dry on the side of the wall. Covey shifted behind her. He called out, his voice stronger than she expected. It was a single, sharp word in his own language. The chief's gaze locked onto him. Another exchange followed, a short, guttural conversation that flew over Alara's head. Covey spoke, then gestured with his good hand, first to his bandaged chest, then to the bearskin, and finally to Alara. He was telling the story. The chief listened, his expression unreadable. When Covey was finished, a deep silence fell once more. The chief's eyes returned to Alara. He looked at her not as a settler, not as a woman, but as a force to be measured. He saw the strength in her stillness, the defiance in her quiet stance. He saw the rifle on its pegs through the open door, and he saw that she had not reached for it. He saw everything. He raised a hand, palm open. A signal. From the line of riders, another man came forward. He led a second horse, a fine-looking pony laden with bundles. He trotted down to the chief, handed him the reins, and retreated back to the ridge. The chief nudged his horse forward a few more feet. He dismounted. He took the bundles from the second horse and laid them on the ground just at the edge of her cleared yard. He unwrapped one. It was a pile of thick, warm buffalo robes. He unwrapped another. It was dried meat, twists of jerky bound with sinew. Another held medicinal herbs, roots, and pouches of something she did not recognize. They were gifts, not tribute, not a bribe. They were a payment of a debt of honor. The chief looked at Covey and spoke a single, soft word. Then he turned his gaze to Alara. He held it for a long moment, a look of profound, solemn respect. He nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged everything that had passed between them without a single shared word. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back to the ridge. At another silent command, the line of warriors turned as one and flowed back over the rise, disappearing as quietly as they had come. The silence they left behind was vast and open. The valley breathed again. The birds started to sing. Elara stood on her porch, her body trembling with the release of tension. Covey leaned against the doorframe, his shoulders slumped in relief. He looked at her, and a small, slow smile touched his lips for the very first time. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows of pain. He is my father, Covey said, his voice quiet. He says the debt is paid. You are. She who stands with bears. Elara looked out at the gifts lying in the grass. She looked at the empty ridge where an army had been only moments before. She looked at the man in her doorway. The debt may have been paid, but something else had just begun. Her world had cracked open, and in the space that was left, something new and wild and hopeful was beginning to grow. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of a future she could not have imagined. The seasons turned. The snows came, blanketing the mountain in a deep, hushed silence. The world outside her cabin became a canvas of white and gray. But inside, for the first time in years, there was life. Covey healed. Slowly, stubbornly. The deep wounds on his chest became puckered, silver scars. His leg mended, and with the help of a sturdy crutch he fashioned from a branch of ash, he began to move about. He could not hunt, he could not ride, but he was not idle. He took over the small tasks that had once been the sole burden of her days. He kept the fire fed, his kindling pile neat and always full. He learned to repair her worn tools, his hands, so skilled with a knife, proving just as adept with a hammer and file. He would sit for hours mending a leather strap or sharpening the blade of her axe until it could shave a hair from her arm. They worked in a shared quiet, a language of parallel motion. She would be at the table, grinding corn into meal, and he would be by the fire, stitching a tear in a moccasin with an awl and sinew. The small sounds of their labor, the scrape of stone on stone, the pull of thread through leather, became the vocabulary of their life together. She taught him her words. Pointing to the fire. Fire, he would repeat it, his tongue shaping the unfamiliar sound. Fire, he would then point to it and say his own word, a soft, guttural sound that sounded like the whisper of flames. He taught her his. He would hold up a piece of jerky. Tassawa, she would try the word, feeling it strange and new in her mouth. They were building a new language, one that belonged only to the two of them in the small, warm space of the cabin. One afternoon, as a blizzard raged outside, trapping them in a world of swirling white, she found him looking at Elias's chair. It sat empty by the window, a silent, hollow testament to a life that was over. He had never sat in it. He respected the invisible line around it. Elara walked over to the chair. She ran her hand over the worn wood of the armrest, a place where Elias's hand had rested 1,000 times. She felt a familiar pang of grief, but it was different now. It was not a sharp, tearing pain, but a dull, distant ache. A memory, not a wound. She looked at Covey. His eyes were full of a gentle understanding. He knew what that chair was. He knew whose ghost occupied it. She took a deep breath. She pushed the chair closer to the fire, into the circle of their shared warmth. "Sit," she said softly. He looked from the chair to her face, his expression uncertain. She nodded, giving him permission. He slowly, carefully lowered himself into it. The chair groaned under his weight, a familiar sound. He looked small in it for a moment, then he seemed to settle, to belong. In that moment, the ghost of Elias did not vanish. He simply made room. The house breathed again. It was no longer a place of waiting for an end, but a place of beginning. The buffalo robes from his people were warm on her bed. The food they had left had sustained them through the hardest part of the winter. One evening, they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf. Covey was carving a piece of wood. He was always carving something. Small animals, birds, faces full of a strange, stark beauty. He held up his latest creation. It was a small, intricately carved bear. It was standing on its hind legs, not in fury, but in a gesture of power and respect. He held it out to her, a gift. She took it, the wood smooth and warm in her palm. "For she who stands with bears," he said, his English slow but sure. She closed her fingers around the carving. A name. He had given her a name. It was more precious than any jewel. She was no longer just Elara, the widow on the mountain. She was someone else now, Someone stronger. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick. He simply nodded, his eyes glowing in the firelight. He understood that her thanks were for more than the small carving. They were for everything, for staying, for filling the silence, for helping her heal a wound she did not even know she carried. Spring came, a slow, wet melt that turned the world to mud and then to a riot of green. The stream swelled and the air filled with the smell of damp earth and new life. Covey's leg was strong now. He walked with only a slight limp, a faint reminder of the day the world had cracked open. One morning he was gone. Elara woke to an empty cabin. The fire was banked, his sleeping roll was gone, and the space he had occupied was a hollow ache in the room. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. He had left. He had gone back to his people. The winter had just been a pause, a convalescence. She had been a fool to think it was anything more. She ran to the door and threw it open, her heart hammering. She scanned the tree line, the meadows, the ridges. Nothing. The world was empty, just as it had been before. The silence rushed back in, louder than ever. She sank onto the porch steps, the rough wood cold against her skin. She had been alone before, but this was a new kind of lonely. A deeper kind. She had not known how much space he had taken up in her world until he was gone. She sat there for what felt like hours, watching the sun rise, feeling the warmth on her face but not in her soul. She felt hollowed out. And then she saw him. He was walking out of the woods leading a horse. Her horse. The one that had gone lame last fall, the one she had thought she would have to put down. He had spent the last month tending to it in secret, using the herbs his people had left, wrapping its leg, walking it gently. And the horse was not lame anymore. It walked with a steady, even gait. Covey stopped in front of the porch, the horse's reins in his hand. He looked at her, at the panic still lingering in her eyes. "I do not leave," he said, his voice low and steady. It was a promise. A vow. He held the reins out to her. She stood up, walked down the steps, and took them. Her fingers brushed his. This time she did not pull away. She let her hand rest there, feeling the warmth and strength in his. She looked from his face to the horse, then back again. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. Not tears of grief, but of a joy so fierce it was painful. That evening they sat on the porch together, watching the stars prick the dark velvet of the sky. The house was quiet behind them, its rooms filled with the comfortable weight of a shared life. They did not speak. They did not need to. Covey reached over and took her hand. His fingers laced with hers, a natural, easy fit. He was no longer a Comanche raider, and she was no longer a lonely widow. They were just two people on a mountain under a vast and watchful sky, stitching their lives together with threads of silence and courage and unspoken kindness. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. And here, in the quiet heart of the wilderness, something new had finally begun to grow. This story, you see, it is not just about a rescue. It is about the language that exists beneath words. It is about the courage to answer the sound of another's pain, even when it comes from a place you have been taught to fear. It is the story of two solitudes that meet and find they are not so solitary after all. So here is your naming. Look for the person whose silence you understand. Look for the stranger whose wounds reflect your own. And if you are brave enough to stand with them when the world comes to watch, you might just find that what you have built is not a fortress, but a home. You might just find that the life you save in the end is your own.